Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hope I didn't wear out my welcome already. I'm here for historical, not political reasons. 150 years ago, yesterday, the Civil War began. 146 years ago, tomorrow, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. And I want to share with you very quickly, if I could, the story of two portraits that hang in our hall, that of John Hale, John Parker Hale, and Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, of course, is our 16th president, and he is the great emancipator and well known to all. John Parker Hale was born in Rochester, raised in Dover. He owned a textile mill there, became a U.S. Senator in the 1940s, and was the first avowed abolitionist in the U.S. Senate. There were anti-slavery senators before him, like Daniel Webster, but he was the first avowed abolitionist, and he was known for that. His career, he crusaded it throughout his career. He was threatened on the floor of the Senate by Southern senators many times, at gunpoint sometimes, and of course he saw the successful culmination of his goal with the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation by Lincoln in 1863. But there's much more to the story. The story just starts there. John Hale had a beautiful young daughter named Lucy Hale. Lucy Hale was the toast of Washington society in a belle. She was sought after by many men and many suitors. John Hale had hoped that his daughter would be a good match for Robert Lincoln, who was the son of the president. But Robert Lincoln spent most of his time during the Civil War being educated in New England, at Phillips Exeter and then at Harvard College. In fact, Lincoln came to New Hampshire famously in February of 1860. He came here basically to see his son, and while he was here he made a political stop. He spoke at the Phoenix Hall, and it's a very famous part of course, Lincoln in New Hampshire. When he spoke there, he praised John Hale for his dedication and fortitude as an abolitionist. But Lucy's favorite suitor was not a president's son. It was, in fact, an actor who lived in Washington by the name of John Wilkes Booth. So John Wilkes Booth and Lucy Hale were supposedly secretly engaged, secretly meaning it wasn't publicly announced. There's a famous picture you may have seen in the Civil War where Booth is eerily close to Lincoln on the second inauguration. That's because she got a ticket from Lucy Hale. Booth pursued Lucy Hale for a long time, and they exchanged rings. It's uncertain whether she did that for access to Lincoln or not, but what is not uncertain is that John Hale despised John Wilkes Booth. He despised him because he was an actor, despised him because he was an avowed and fervent Confederate. So on the morning of April 14th, 146 years ago tomorrow, John Hale, who recently lost his re-election in New Hampshire, went to see the president at the White House and asked to be nominated to the ambassador to Spain. And the reason for that was to remove Lucy from the influence of John Wilkes Booth. While they met, Lucy Hale studied Spanish in the White House with Robert Lincoln, who was home to celebrate the fact that Appomattox surrender had been 5 days earlier, and with John Hay. John Hay is tied to New Hampshire. John Hay was a private secretary to the president, and John Hay retired in New Hampshire on Lake Sunapee, has a big estate, is now a federal park. So the last official act of Abraham Lincoln was to nominate John Parker Hale to be an ambassador. That night, Lucy had dinner with her mother and John Wilkes Booth at a hotel at 8 o'clock. Booth excused himself, went to the theater, and an hour later he shot President Lincoln. Lincoln, of course, died the next day to the shock and the horror of the country, but he is immortalized as our greatest president. Booth escaped, famous manhunt that took 2 weeks. They found him in Virginia, and when they found mortally wounded, they found him in that barn. He did have a ring on, and he did have 5 portraits of women in his pocket, and one of them was Lucy Hale. John Hale and Lucy Hale went on to Spain for the ambassadorship for several years. Interestingly enough, the great investigation by Secretary of War Stanton into the conspiracy of Booth, she never interviewed Lucy Hale. John Hale died shortly after their return. Lucy Hale went on to marry a gentleman by name William Chandler from New Hampshire. The Historical Society was the Chandler household. That's where he played as a child. They had another son named John Parker Hall Chandler, and they had a son, another gentleman by the name of John Chandler. We know him here many years ago when I served from 79 to 83. He was a senator, former state rep who had a seat that sat right over Representative Pamela Alexis is sitting right now, and a counselor. His name was Happy Jack Chandler, and he was a very conservative Mel Thompson Republican. He had his own room up at the Cat and Fiddle that was decorated with flags, and he had meetings every week. And William Loeb was one of the great people that came there and visited quite often. So I actually co-sponsored a bill to put snowmaking on then Mount Sunapee State Park with John Chandler. So I thank you for this indulgence. I think it's interesting. Every time I look at those two portraits, that story goes through my head, and I wanted to share it with you. I thank you.